please welcome Susan Fales-Hill.
Good evening, friends. We're a small but mighty group. Good evening. So happy to have you here and happy not to have to apologize for the weather for the first time in 12 months. So welcome, welcome. Jamaican immigrant to the United States and Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey once said, "A people without a knowledge of its history is like a tree without its roots." And tonight's guest, filmmaker Ric Burns, for 30 years, has been helping us as a nation face the truths about our past. Some of them ennobling and inspiring, others horrific and embarrassing, but always with a depth of research and a passion and an unflinching eye that is just mesmerizing. Whether he is analyzing the Civil War, as he did in the beautiful script that he wrote for the groundbreaking series directed by his brother, whether he is deconstructing the myth of Plymouth Rock in The Pilgrims, whether he is exploring the 300-year history of our glorious city of New York, the quintessential American city, whether he is doing a biography of an American maverick creator like Eugene O'Neill, he invites us always to look at ourselves honestly. And he celebrates what Whitman called the teeming nation of nations. And he invites us to ask ourselves what it means to be an American. He is the winner of 7 Emmy Awards, 3, God bless you, 3 Alfred DuPont and Columbia University Journalism Awards, and 2 Peabodys. Can the Nobel be far behind? I don't think so. His new film, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we will be discussing tonight with 2 of his fellow filmmakers, once again looks at the history of our country and examines the centrality of the question of immigration to our democracy's struggle to live up to its founding creed that all men and women are created equal. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome an icon and an innovator and a man who has raised documentary filmmaking to an art form, Ric Burns. So I think we'll put ourselves here.
Good, perfect. Hi.
We've got a friendly crowd here. Although I'm concerned about the people sitting at the back. Do we look mean? You just like it back there. So Ric, I always like to begin with what formed people. And I know you are a son of the city of Baltimore, which again is a quintessential American city. It has one of the largest and oldest Jewish populations.
It does.
It's a port. It was a very Catholic city. It stands at the sort of crossroads of the North and South. How did it form you? You were born in 1955. How did Baltimore and growing up in Baltimore shape you?
You know, the Delmarva Peninsula, where my family migrated to by the time I was 6 months old, from Baltimore, where my father's family was from, is, you know, that entire part of the American world is an amazing, interesting place.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I think was most redolent for me growing up in Delaware, but then visiting my grandmother and grandfather who lived in Mount Washington, a kind of an outlying area of Baltimore, was the sort of the smell of the beech trees in the summer, because there's a particularly languid, not quite southern, but certainly not northern sort of summer air in the Baltimore region. And it's one of those in-between places, as you say. It's Catholic, it's Jewish, it's African-American, and there's some quality of sort of falling between a number of American stools that I've always found very, very moving about it.
And how aware were you of the civil rights movement? You were a little boy when these things were raging, and
you know, it's funny. Living in Delaware, in Newark, Delaware, you know, there were colored signs, colored, you know, water fountains. Available to be seen by a 5-year-old in 1960, which is sort of astonishing. Or to go to Dover, go to Rehoboth Beach, and discover that we're still more than traces of that in what's technically a northern state. And I think that it was it was striking to grow up in that kind of sort of in a situation from a very liberal family. My father's parents were both academics, both biologists. My grandmother had gotten a PhD at Yale in the 1920s.
When women didn't do
in
that.
biology, when women really didn't do that.
Not if they wanted to get married.
Exactly. And she got her degree ahead of my grandfather, who also was a biologist and had quite a distinguished career. And I think the distinction of his career was supercharged by the fact that his wife and the mother of his 3 boys, was herself an extraordinarily gifted biologist as well and a botanist. And so there's a kind of a liberal bias to the family, going way back. And a sort of a sense of a kind of trying to make your way in a world in the 1960s where the civil rights movement was obviously well underway, in this funny, in-between, not quite fully southern, not quite fully northern town of Baltimore, where you could really feel it.
Yeah.
Where down at the bottom of the hill along Kelly Avenue, my grandparents lived at 2115 Kelly Avenue, up on top of a hill in a kind of a lovely residential area, and then down and along Kelly Avenue was like a row of like very, very modest houses down by the bus stop where African Americans lived, most of them servicing the lives
houses.
of white Baltimoreans.
Yeah.
So it was a striking time and place to grow up, kind of a really liminal moment in American history as things were changing.
And your father was an anthropologist, was he not?
My father was an anthropologist. He was the oldest of 3 boys. My grandfather never really forgave him for going into a non-hard science.
I sense an anthropological approach to some of your films. Do you feel shaped by his?
I think kind of inevitably. Within just the osmosis of it. He was also an obsessive sort of storyteller. And he would tell my brother and I sort of infinitely chapterized versions of aspects of American history, like the Second World War. So sometimes it would be the war at sea, or it would be like sort of rivets flying in submarines as they went down. And he had this kind of sort of almost obsessive desire to grab us by the lapels and tell us stories in detail. That he had absorbed, at his parents' need.
And so history was quite an organic part of your upbringing. And
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, almost like it was so much the air we breathe that I don't even think we noticed it.
Right.
In a certain way. And so it wasn't as if we grew up, I think either Ken or I, thinking that we would be historians.
No.
And Ken's original plan was to be a photographer and a filmmaker.
And
then
what was your
immediately
original?
gravitated. Well, my first thing was I was the younger of the two and vastly more rebellious, and was going to be a drummer in a rock and roll band called Susie and the Pimps. In Ann Arbor.
I was not that Susie, but it's okay. Just want to make that clear.
No, you were not that one. But I was certainly one of the Pimps as a drummer. And, we had, by that time had migrated to Ann Arbor, Michigan, which was an incredible place to be in the
big academic
town.
town.
We arrived in 1963. And then the next year there was the bombing of Hanoi that began, and teach-ins, and so to be in this very, very comfortable, large university town, both sort of feeling on the front lines on the one hand, also strangely sheltered in a certain way, was an amazing experience to have in the 60s and the 70s.
And when did you realize that film was your medium and your way of telling stories?
Having gravitated, towards being the best rock and roll drummer in southeastern Michigan, which was sort of
with
a
Susie
joke.
and the Pimps.
With Susie and the Pimps, I then the minute I hit college, I had a kind of a brainstorm. Ken was sort of the opposite. He had been a straight A student in high school, and then applied to one school only, Hampshire College, which was in its second year of existence, and decided he was going to become an artist. So we did this funny sort of crisscross from being the more rebellious one to suddenly I wanted to be a professor of English. And went to Columbia and went to Cambridge, and came back and was sort of working on my PhD in the 80s, and sometimes helping Ken somewhat disdainfully in the early part of his career, because I thought he was sort of doing like a kind of an elaborate kind of slideshow. And then I realized it was actually far more challenging than anything I was doing.
Right.
And that there was nothing more electrifying than watching what would happen when you might just sort of take two images and bang them against each other in an editing room and discover that one and one didn't always just make two. Sometimes it made 3, sometimes it made 4, 5, or 6. And that electrifying power that film which is such a challenging medium, has, when it does, in fact, add up to more than the sum of its parts. And there was literally, I had a kind of a come to Jesus moment kind of in my brother's editing room when he was working on the second film he and my former sister-in-law Amy Steckler did on the Shakers, and just kind of went, this is incredible. I want to eat what they're eating.
So much for teaching Chaucer.
So Ken, he in the mid 80s, having in that first phase of his career alienated the way incredibly gifted people do all the people he had initially worked with, he'd looked around to look at someone who's not completely untalented who might still be willing to work with him. And so he asked his younger brother to sort of join the posse for a while. And I sort of piled in 1985 to work on the Civil War series, and then never really looked back.
Never left, and won an Emmy for that script.
And with no regrets.
No, none whatsoever. How do you pick your stories? There's a through line. I mean, when the book is written on you and your work, there is a through line. But how do you pick? When do you decide it's time to do the Pilgrims and the Mayflower?
So I think that there's a powerful kind of consistency to the kinds of stories. I mean, I think that's unsurprising. I think most people are drawn to these. They're stories of really tremendous transfiguration, where things are not the same at the end as they are in the beginning. And that's sort of like roughly the definition of any story.
Yes.
But, if you're like a party of, 86 people who leave, during the pioneer period to go across the West.
He's referring to the Donner Party.
And you go there thinking, you set out in April of 1846 thinking that you're going to trade up to yet another great American experience.
Yep.
And then discover that half of you live and half of you die, and the ones who live survive by eating the ones who didn't. And that you're not in Kansas anymore, quite literally. And there's a way in which I think there's a kind of a dreamlike power to stories of transfiguration, which you can find in all sorts of domains.
Right.
But I think that that's the kind of radioactive core that draws anybody when you want to make a film, because at the core of a film is a story. It's a real relentlessly narrative medium, inevitably narrative medium. You know that kind of from the way the film runs through the gate as you take the pictures, and the way it's projected back when you show them. And even though you can stop it, nobody ever wants you to stop the story in the middle of it, and they want you to sort of get in that river of light and sound and continue until it's done. And that, the challenge of that and the joy of that is made all the greater when you have these moments in which people start out with one set of motives and are overtaken by forces and processes which they didn't expect or didn't fully understand was going to be involved when they set out from home, and that they end up being very, very different.
Yeah.
And I think that, every film I've worked on, almost without exception, has that quality. Maybe not the New York series,
right,
although it may be a kind of a continuous transformation.
For some of the characters, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Earlier in my career, I had that kind of young person's vanity that you wanted to only work on the stories that you had thought of. And that's what real artists did.
Yes, because every idea is original.
Every idea is original, and that you want to really be sort of expressing yourself. And that, like anybody who works in any craft, you discover quickly that no one is sort of fertile and fecund and imaginative enough to come across, new ideas all the time.
Yeah.
And that, in fact, the danger any of us run into is of self-repetition and kind of becoming a cliche of your own instincts and initiatives. And so what I've discovered in the last 10 or 15 years, and certainly the Chinese Exclusion Act film is sort of a perfect example of that, is that it's not as if I'll do anything anybody asks me to do, but I'm very, very struck by ideas which I had not thought of myself, particularly when they kind of sort of dissolve into your psyche, and you begin to realize, well, I would never have thought to do a film about Andy Warhol. But now that you think about it, what an extraordinary opportunity to tell another story of transfiguration. And so I would say over the last 10 or 15 years, increasingly, I've been drawn to material which has taken me outside not so much my comfort zone, but outside what I would have certainly have expected I might be doing 15 or 20 years ago.
Right.
And I'm kind of overjoyed to be doing it.
Well, and it shows on screen. Now, you and your brother pioneered a new style using sort of original text materials, not relying so much on footage.
Right.
But I did notice in The Pilgrims that you you used Roger Rees to play actually my ancestor, William Bradford,
Right.
which after watching the movie, I realized I shouldn't be so proud of.
Oh, I don't know. Very complicated.
Very, very complicated man. What prompted that decision? Because that seems a departure from your usual having people
I think
read
it was an
original
evolution that was more or less inevitable. If you're going to tell a story only using the tools of film and photography, you're really stuck.
In the
And you're not
17th century.
The 17th century is not going to be beckoning you quickly.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get back before, the Donner Party, there happened to be a half dozen photographs. That's
Right.
1846, so the daguerreotype exists.
Yep.
And thank goodness that it did, but you couldn't, you can't go much further back than that.
Right.
And I think that the truth is that any film that's working, it doesn't have to have, quote, original material.
Right.
It has to have something which the viewer gets right away, a sort of an instinctive sense of sort of commitment to the truth of the story, and a commitment to a sort of a craft value, which is that you're going to use whatever tools you've made available to yourself in as accurate and faithful a way as possible. And if that involves recreations or reenactments, listen, if there were film footage of William Bradford, I guess that would be fantastic. But in lieu of that, I would say discovering that among Roger Rees's amazing gifts,
God rest him.
extraordinary, talented man who unfortunately died too young a few years ago, right after we had the good fortune to work with him, that, Roger is one of those people who made Jacobean Elizabethan diction was sort of second nature to him. And so someone who was sort of a self-taught autodidact like William Bradford, 12-year-old orphan, from, the north parts of England, who sort of was extraordinarily gifted and spiritually gifted and driven. That Roger could find a way into William Bradford's not unique, but really interestingly sort of idiosyncratic writing style, and make even the word et cetera have a kind of like a certain resonant quality.
Yes.
There is a way in which you want to turn a camera on somebody like that who's imaginatively taking possession of a text from the past, arguably the first most important text in American history, William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation, and the letters that Bradford left behind as well, and using his own enormous gifts as an actor to sort of inhabit that in a way that a camera and a microphone can eavesdrop on.
Yes.
Why isn't that as powerful a document of history as you possibly can, particularly when you can also then go to Beacon Hill, go to the State House of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, see this incredible text, which was lost to history for a couple hundred years, from the Revolution, in any case, until the late 19th century. And to actually see written in Bradford's own script, this book, in vellum, 270 pages, which he had laboriously sort of torn out of his soul in the 1630s, when he realized that the Pilgrim experiment was kind of falling apart, sort of failing because it had succeeded, and now in came the Puritans who did not believe what the separatist Pilgrims did, and sort of kind of pulling out of his own heart this kind of testament to why did we matter? Why was this an important sort of phase in anybody's history, let alone our own? And to find that there was someone as gifted as Roger Rees to be able to sort of bring that magnificent text alive was really, really startling.
So before we bring out your colleagues, we're going to see a clip of this beautiful film, The Chinese Exclusion Act, which is going to be on PBS on May 29th, and reveals a not very widely known and very ugly chapter of American immigration history.
Also sort of inspiring, too.
Very, very inspiring. We're going to get to the inspiration,
Yeah.
but it's hard-hitting. So if we can roll the clip before we bring out.
夜靜微聞風笑聲，形影相情見景永，雲霧散散也暗天，重聲寂寂月未明。
The solitary arm of the unfinished Statue of Liberty had languished on Madison Square in New York for more than 5 years, when on May 6, 1882, on the eve of the greatest wave of immigration in American history, President Chester A. Arthur signed into law an extraordinary piece of federal legislation. It was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, singling out as never before a specific race and nationality for exclusion. It made it illegal for Chinese workers to come to America, and for Chinese nationals already here ever to become citizens of the United States. The first in a long line of acts targeting the Chinese for exclusion. It would remain in force for more than 60 years.
Chinese Americans always have this identification with the founding principle of this country. The Chinese identify with this fundamental principle of liberty, equality, and justice for all. And all men are created equal. Now, how can you say that this is a group of people who are biologically and culturally unfit to live a civilized life?
We have to remember that in the 19th century, immigration into the United States was basically open. You just showed up. So the Chinese exclusion law is really the first and only time in the entire history of the United States that a group is singled out by name, Chinese, by name, as being undesirable.
But this is a group of people, Chinese American, the Chinese that were here, who actually fought back and made America what it is today, the values that we have, including equal protection under the law, rights to education, what it means to be American, what makes you American, to be born here. All these weren't defined.
I think it's essential that Americans know about the exclusion of Chinese, not because it's the Chinese, but because it reflects how America has come to develop, how America saw itself at one time, and how it continues to see itself. Some of it has to do with the fact that we excluded Chinese for 60 years.
And now it's my pleasure to bring out your co-filmmakers, your editor of 23 years and your co-director on this, Li-Shin, and a professor of history and the Lung Professor of Asian American Studies at Columbia University, also the author of two books and a third on the way, and countless op-ed articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post, Mae Ngai. Ladies, if you could join us. Li-Shin, the co-director and editor, and Mae Ngai. This is Mae. This is Li-Shin.
Good evening.
Good evening and welcome, and thank you for being with us this evening. This is an extraordinarily moving film. Can you give us a little background on how it came to be? Because we're going back, the process started in 2012, didn't it?
We were lucky, Li-Shin and I, to be approached by the New York Historical Society, by Louise Mirror.
Who's the head of the New York Historical Society.
Visionary, sort of head of the New York Historical Society, whose idea it was to do an exhibit on the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is arguably one of the least well-known chapters in American history, and particularly startling and troubling given the importance of this material. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of piled in with Louise and a remarkable group of historians at the New York Historical Society, including Mae Ngai, and a number of her colleagues, and sort of followed their lead down this extraordinary path.
Mae, can you set the table a bit, because it is an act that's not well known and certainly not studied in American schools. So can you quickly set the table on when it came about and what the tipping point was, because it was a long time coming and there was a lot of back and forth.
Right. I think to understand Chinese exclusion, we have to understand the history of westward expansion in the United States, the movement of Americans throughout, across the country to the West Coast, which accelerates with the discovery of gold in 1848. And what happens in California is that everybody in the world shows up. It's not just Americans from the East who go there. There are people from Europe, from the British Isles, from Chile, from Mexico, Australia, and from China. So you have this really polyglot population of mostly men digging for gold. And as we know, the gold rushes are kind of crazy, right? It's very competitive. It's like a feverish atmosphere. So white Americans use the politics of nativism as a competitive weapon, right? So they actually don't aim it first at Chinese, because the Chinese show up a little late. So they aim it at Mexicans and Chileans. There's a lot of violence and aggression to drive them out of the gold fields. And a lot of that was a competitive thing, because people from Sonora were silver miners, and they were actually quite experienced at mining, as were the Chileans. But they also targeted French, Belgian, Australians. But they came to settle on the Chinese because they kind of drove out everybody else first. And the Chinese, how they attacked the Chinese was a little different. They didn't just say they're foreign, they said they're like slaves, that they were a slave-like race. And this immediately associated Chinese with African American slavery in the South. So it became a kind of racial stereotype that ran very deep and for a very, very long time. And it was wound up in Civil War politics about, this is a fight against slavery, it's a fight for free labor, and it became a kind of shortcut to exclude the Chinese, who actually were just like other miners. They were not enslaved. They were not coolies, as they were called.
But people were afraid of them as cheap labor. So
Well, they said they would be cheap labor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Li-Shin, this was your first time co-directing with Ric.
Right.
What was that to make that shift from being the editor exclusively to also being a director?
It's really incredible to be out there, sort of on the forefront. But so there's the excitement of it, but also feeling the weight of it to get the story right. But one of our first filming was at the Huntington Library in California,
Pasadena.
And to kind of see these historical documents so clearly, because usually I'm in the editing room, I see them kind of as degraded, offline, images. To see them in real life kind of really brought the story, the veracity of it. It's like there's no denying that this history happened, and how virulent some of the hatred and racism was, and it really kind of drill more deeply in me, sort of this story has to be told, and told, correctly.
I was asking you both earlier what your awareness was growing up of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, you are an actual first-generation Chinese American, and you said
Right, my parents were immigrants, and obviously we didn't learn about the Chinese exclusion or any Asian American history in the schools in those days. And my parents really didn't know about the Chinese Exclusion Act, although they did know, they came in the late 1940s, they did know that Chinese had a quota of 105 a year. And this is post-repeal of exclusion, right? Exclusion is repealed in 1943, and yet, and this is really the proof that Congress did not repeal exclusion because they wanted more Chinese to come. They repealed exclusion in 43 as part of a wartime, geopolitics.
They didn't want the Japanese to be able to use the propaganda that
Exactly.
America was discriminating against the Chinese as they were killing the Chinese themselves. There's an incredible image throughout the film of the building of the Statue of Liberty, which, much like our knowledge of the history of this country, we think, oh, well, the revolution was fought and everyone had rights. And there's this beautiful metaphor of this statue that's being assembled. When did you come across that story and realize that it was going to be a significant thread?
I think that when we were first made aware of the story of Samsung Bo, who was a Chinese American who had been educated in an earlier version of the University of Chicago and then come east, hoped to be a lawyer, And in the mid-1880s, as the subscription drive to raise funds for the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty got underway, the statue itself was completed, but languishing in warehouses. And he was, as many people were, including many Chinese Americans, was the recipient of a subscription fund drive saying, please contribute to the building the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. And he wrote, and this was really kind of common amongst Chinese Americans when they sort of engaged the story, wrote with an extraordinary passion and eloquence, using very artfully and very meaningfully sort of the rhetoric of America's sort of deepest ideals, having to do with freedom, having to do with democracy, having to do with the rule of law, but laced with a kind of irony, saying, as honored as I and my colleagues are to have been invited to join this subscription drive, we find it tremendously ironic that we should be reached out to when we are the one people in America who cannot come here unless we also already happen to be here, and if we are here, we can't become American citizens. And indeed, Samsung Bo, whose fondest dream was to become a lawyer, was never able to become a lawyer because he was not a citizen of the United States. To have that taking place in 1885, 3 years after the act was signed into law, a year before the Statue of Liberty went up, made you realize that it was, it's a metaphor in a way, but it's one of those wonderful concrete, it's partly happenstance and partly circumstance, and shows you that memory, value, principle, law are not things that are enshrined once and for all. They're works in progress that are under construction constantly, now no more or less so than in 1885 or than in 1776. And that this whole idea that's so powerful in the American sense of itself, we're a nation of immigrants, that we are a nation that believes in welcoming diverse constituencies from all over the world. Where did that come from? When and where was it decided that we are a nation of immigrants? What has been our attitude towards immigrants? What does it mean to be an American? How do you become American, and who has decided over time what it means to be American? So right there next to the arguably the most potent symbol of a kind of a condensed, not to say conventionalized version of America's values, the Statue of Liberty, turns out to be this story of how over a very long period of time, those values were both made a mockery of and fought for, and perhaps restabilized and renovated through this story called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is, I want to say, it's not a marginal story. It is the American immigrant story par excellence, and tells you more about memory and forgetting, more about how we became the American society that we have been over time, with such complicated, powerful, and to this day divisive feelings about immigration and immigrants and citizenship.
Well, to that point, because these are the foundational cases that really made the 14th Amendment of equal protection live, can you talk to us about the 1898 Supreme Court decision that established once and for all that if you were born in this country, you were a citizen of this country, which most of us grew up thinking that was just always the law, and yet.
Right. The 14th Amendment, the first words of it say that every person born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof is a citizen of the United States. And that is what we understand to be birthright citizenship. If you're born on U.S. soil, you are a citizen. Well, what that actually meant was not as clear as the language would suggest. It took 30 years, 25, 30 years, to actually say that's what it really meant. And throughout this time, it is the time of anti-Chinese racism, violence, and hysteria. And a lot of the nativists said, well, it doesn't really apply to Chinese because they're accidental citizens, right? If Congress doesn't want their parents here, why would we want their children here? The fact that they're born here is just an accident. So, and they call them pseudo-citizens, accidental citizens, fake citizens. And Wong Kim Ark was a young Chinese man who was born in the United States to Chinese immigrant parents, so he was a citizen. As in many families, they took him back to China when he was a young boy, and then he returned to the United States, and they excluded him, and he said, but I'm a citizen. And so then it goes through the courts. And what I think is important about the court's ruling is the Supreme Court said, well, you know, the language is plain, and if we start fiddling with that, we're going to jeopardize the citizenship of all the children of the Europeans. So it's not because they had any affection or commitment to equality for Chinese. They could see down the road that if you started to make exceptions to the 14th Amendment, it might jeopardize the standing of white Americans.
Yep, it's fascinating. Li-Shin, you started making the film in the, 2012, 2013.
Right.
But then by the time you got to editing it, there was a certain election taking place.
Right.
And then a certain person got elected. Right. And then we started hearing about other groups being excluded. What was it to be editing this as all of this was beginning to roil again?
Yeah, it's incredible. You know, I didn't know this history either, you know, growing up. And there's sort of a symmetry. Was like 1982 was where the Vincent Chin case was roaring in Detroit, where a young Chinese man who was out on his bachelor's party got mistaken as a Japanese worker, and two unemployed auto workers essentially beat him to death. And so that was going on, and I, you know, as a young person in New York, was hearing about it and was just enraged and kind of just like, how could this happen? And it's very much, I think, how the Black Lives Matter, you know, people are feeling right now. And this was exactly 100 years since the Chinese Exclusion Law was passed. So. But at that time, I didn't understand the connection of contemporary incidents to history. And so over time, as I learned about the history and working with Ric, where you study history in its larger context, it became increasingly clear that there was a connection. And so for me, sort of as we were editing, it became clear, okay, tell the story as factually, as clearly as what had happened in history, and what's going on outside the door will just, you know, reveal itself. And so although we didn't set out trying to necessarily make a connection, we didn't need to.
You don't have to.
We
It's
didn't
right
need
there.
to, yeah.
And you've
Right.
written about that in some of your op-ed pieces. You have hours and hours and hours of footage. What is on the cutting room floor that would be on your wish I could have included it, but I can't do Berlin Alexanderplatz?
You know, we're pretty perverse and obstinate about including the things that we want to include. And I also think that in the case of this story, one of its great powerful virtues and what's thrilling about it, just sort of intellectually and humanly, is that you can't understand Chinese exclusion by just kind of focusing in on, you know, the spring of 1882 when the legislation was passed.
Right.
And when you begin to say, well, where does the story begin?
Yep.
What you realize is that it begins with the beginning of America. That, you know, America was a global project, a projection of power on Europeans' part in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, out of which we came. And that if you want to tell the story of Chinese exclusion so that you understand it, which is really the story of the movement of people and things on a global scale and what happens in specific places as those people and things shift around and people compete for the resources that they make possible. You put it in that context, and you have to go back to the first beat of the Chinese Exclusion Act story is taking place in 1783, when the first ship to leave New York Harbor after the Revolutionary War is the Empress of China, heading for China. Because now that they've won the war, the Americans are discovering that there's a downside, which is they're excluded from the British Commonwealth by the British, who are enraged at them. So where are they going to be able to pay off the massive debt? How are they going to start an economy that will make this new experiment possible? They go to China.
Yep.
So the China trade is laced into this right from the very beginning. What you sort of discover is this incredible braiding of forces that comes surging out of the 18th century. It involves China just as much as it involves America. It involves the whole world. But you to understand it, you really have to pull on this red thread that essentially goes throughout American history. That, to me, was thrilling to see. So it's one of those kind of heuristic sort of opportunities. You could learn, I don't want to say everything about American history by studying the Chinese Exclusion Act, where it came from, how it came into being, what its impact was down to today. But I guarantee you, you're going to discover an enormous amount about it, and you're going to discover an enormous amount about this particular piece, which is how we have come to define legally, politically, rhetorically, ideologically, what does it mean to be an American. So in that sense, I felt, Susan, that we didn't have to leave much on the cutting room floor at all. What we had to do is we needed the guidance of this remarkable group of historians, Mae Ngai, first among equals amongst them, to help us navigate what is not only complicated just when you dip into it legislatively in the 1880s, but complicated across what's the entire arc of American history. And this amazing cadre of historians, as amazing as any that Li-Shin and I have had the good fortune to be able to be involved with, really have made this subject come alive in a really remarkable way that's completely current. I mean, this is historiography happening kind of in front of you, with Mae being one of the chief examples of it, but there's an amazing group of people, historians, who are making this story real and profound, and finding the archives and finding the documents and finding the stories. It has to be pieced together in the most intimate and really moving way from pieces of history which are very largely the discarded pieces of history. Immigration documents, little things that are sort of like cast off in boxes outside of Sacramento. I mean, it's not, these are not chiseled in marble except for Wong Kim Ark, in the large edifice of American history, and nevertheless, they really are part of the DNA of our history as much as anything else.
Absolutely. Mae, can you reflect a little bit on how the notion of American citizenship is being, again, redebated today? And you wrote a very interesting op-ed piece saying the Muslims are the Chinese, basically, of the 21st century.
Right, the Muslims are the new Chinese.
Yeah.
And that is true on two levels. On the more obvious level, it's the Muslims are being singled out now as the other, to be despised and to be excluded. But on another level, and I think this is hopefully what people can learn more about, is that what was the rationale for Chinese exclusion? It wasn't just that Chinese were a despised race, but there had to be a legal justification for excluding them. So this is after the Civil War. This is post 14th Amendment. Can you just exclude people by naming them and saying you can't come in? So what the Supreme Court did when it upheld Chinese exclusion in 1889 was it said immigration is an incident of our foreign policy. It's a question of national security. Before this, now that's what we all hear today, right? Immigration is national security. Before Chinese exclusion, immigration was not thought of in that way. It was thought of as a matter of commerce. Immigrants were articles of commerce. And if you think of immigrants mostly being economic migrants, as being laborers, workers, as well as merchants, it is a commercial activity. And so, but to justify exclusion of a group by name, the Supreme Court said, this is really a matter of national sovereignty. This is a matter of national security. And in matters of national security, Congress can do absolutely whatever it wants. So put immigration in the same legal basket with the power to declare war, the power to make treaties. It's something that does not fall under the Constitution. It's outside of the Constitution. And that is why Muslims are the new Chinese, because what the president is saying with the executive orders, which we're now waiting for the Supreme Court to rule on this, is that he's not anti-Muslim. It's just it's about terrorism and it's about national security. And so the big question is, can the court look at that rationale and say, well, you didn't exclude all these other people for national security reasons, like Pakistan's not on the list, right, et cetera. So, the administration has gone through somersaults and gymnastics to try to
I mean, they wrote the travel ban 3 times, and now he says, now we have the politically correct version because they put North Korea on the list, right, which is not a Muslim country.
Yep, and Venezuela, I think.
And
is on it.
Venezuela. So the question is the court going to see through this? But the reason why I say Muslims are the new Chinese is because it's the invocation of national security as to why we have to keep out a whole group based on their religion, right, which is kind of nowadays seen as a race.
Yes.
Right? It's kind of a racial religious
Absolutely.
exclusion.
Well, I have to say, one of the great notes of hope in this very beautiful film is the degree to which the Chinese fought for their rights and used the courts as their battling ground. There were 10,000 lawsuits between 1882 and 1905.
You couldn't go to the ballot box.
Right.
So you took it to court.
But the
And
fact
they took it to court.
They took it to court.
I don't know if the statistic is 9 or 10% of the Chinese Americans went to court over these issues, but it was something very
It's a
close to that,
significant
like 1
number.
in 10.
Absolutely.
We took it to court, and it became part of, Wong Kim Ark in 1898 is this sort of signature piece where every law student in America knows Wong Kim Ark now, Birthright Citizenship, affirmed by the Supreme Court. But it's really sort of the jewel in the crown of what's an amazing and very, very significant impact on the structure of American law and value having to do with immigration, the movement of people, citizenship, to the lesser extent, civil rights. But it's really an amazing, amazing, inspiring thing where you discover, like, maybe if you're looking for Americans, maybe you want to go to China, because you're going to discover there's some people already forming some ideas over there to come over here, and they're going to have a better idea during the first 20, 30, 40, 50 years they're here of what it is to be an American than you do. And that's really one of the really inspiring things that the American experiment really, at its best, is discovering that it's not just refreshed and replenished by new peoples from abroad, which it is, but also that the tensile strength of its best ideas are tested and reaffirmed by people who come and say, we come from, South China. We really like this idea of a rule of law. We think it's ludicrous that we're being excluded. And so we're going to fight in every way we possibly can, in the press and in courts chiefly, to improve this system. So I know I'm an American citizen, born as I was in 1955 in Baltimore, because thank you very much, Wong Kim Ark, 1898.
Well,
established
the
once and
Chinese
for all.
made America what it is today. I'd like to open the floor for questions, if anyone has any. This is Alexis Clark, who's actually coming out with an extraordinary nonfiction book about a black nurse in World War II, African American, who fell in love with a German prisoner of war and remained married to him from the 1940s until 2000. It's called Enemies in Love. So.
Thank you. I'm very much looking forward to seeing this documentary. But what I was thinking about is, how do we get this information into classrooms? Because I went to very good schools, but I did not have Asian American history. And it wasn't until I moved to New York and actually was a journalism student at Columbia, and we were assigned your documentary, which was riveting on New York City, because there was so much of it I didn't know. And my concern is, so much of education is still relying on these textbooks that are very selective in the information that they convey. So how do we get this into schools and universities?
It's even worse than that. It's worse than that. It's not just that they have textbooks that exclude important parts of our history, is they are teaching kids to test. They are, in New York, they have very strict curricula. I did a workshop with New York City middle school and high school teachers on the 14th Amendment. And I asked them, I said, how are you going to teach the 14th Amendment differently now that we've had this workshop? And they said, we don't have time to teach the 14th Amendment. So I don't know what the answer to that question is. I think, teachers might have to sneak it in. Rick and Li-Shin have done some great work to cut small segments out of the film that can be shown in classrooms, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, and I think there's a 40-minute version or something. And I think those can definitely be shown in college classrooms, but I don't know how we're going to get into the K-12. I really don't.
I think partly you have to just try to bang down the door by starting a film about, Chinese exclusion with the as yet unassembled foot of the Statue of Liberty, and make it clear that this is not just simply a piece of history you don't know. this is a piece of the most important aspect of the body politic of America, which you don't know about. And it's almost like, I think, the gamble visually and narratively of our film is to say, you know what? Pretend for a moment that this story is as important as the foot of the Statue of Liberty, and that there's some reason why this is being brought up in that context. And it's self-evident to me and to Li-Shin, and I'm sure it is to Mae as well, that this is one of the most important unknown stories. So I think we just want to sort of batter down the gates and say, listen, we have not been a nation of immigrants that has welcomed immigrants. We have been a nation of immigrants that has felt powerfully ambivalent about it, and that ambivalence has risen and ebbed and flowed over time. We're living in one of those moments where it's flowing strong. But it has always ebbed and flowed. And you're not going to understand America, and you're not going to understand how to make a decision about should we keep somebody out or should we not, if you don't understand where it came from. So it's our following Mae, following a number of incredible historians who have kind of pioneered this field, to say, listen, this needs to be on the curriculum of every secondary school in the country. I mean, if we're going to know about the Boston Tea Party, and if we're going to know about the Statue of Liberty, we've got to know about the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Particularly since, I was going to say, in my research, after World War II, we still allowed thousands of Germans to get sponsorship to come back to the United States and live, because so much of their country had been bombed. So when you think about the argument of national security, that doesn't bode well when we return from a war. So it's definitely totally around discrimination.
Right. I do want to say, though, that I think having film is a great way to get into the classroom, because it conveys information concisely, in visually arresting way. A lot can be done in a 5-minute snippet on Wong Kim Ark that may not have the time or to give a whole lecture, a 40-minute lecture on it. So I think film is a great way to get in there.
Yeah, our production partner, Center for Asian American Media, is really spearheading this, and they're working with the Oakland School District teachers to create these little, moments in history that could be, whether it's, pushing it on curriculum, sneaking it in, however, is to get this history taught so that people know about it.
Definitely.
What is the hope that you all have for your film and the impact it will have in America? I ask this in the context of 5 years ago, having gone on a little trip with my daughter to Chinatown and look around. And we stumbled upon the Museum of Chinese in America, which I had never heard about. We spent 2 hours in that museum just experiencing these extraordinary stories and a history that we had never been aware of. And since that time, I have heard nothing more about those stories. So I'm delighted to hear of your movie. And you made a number of analogies to African Americans in America. And I think about the African American Museum in Washington, D.C., and the huge amount of interest there is, and the number of people, including the President of France and so forth, who have visited the museum most recently, and the stories that have come out of that. What is your hope that your film will have in raising this issue and making people aware of these incredible stories?
Every one of our historians coming out of the gate said, listen, this is not primarily a Chinese American story. This is an American story. That obviously many of the principles, the 110,000 Chinese Americans who were here during the exclusion period. So there was a way in which they were where the spear point, met flesh. But this is so profoundly an American story. When you think about the way all of the immigration legislation was scaffolded on the series of laws beginning in 1882, 1892, 1902, 1904, it becomes more or less permanent Previously, before that, it had to be re-upped by Congress every 10 years. And then they said, now for the foreseeable future, after 1904, it's going to be the law of the land. And then that becomes the scaffold for what became the Asiatic Barred Zone in 1917, towards the end of the First World War. And that itself was the scaffolding for this remarkable shutdown of immigration in America in 1924, where basically America went from saying, we've had 1 million, sometimes 1.2 million a year coming in. We're going to squeeze this down to essentially nothing, 150,000 a year, starting in 1924. And how was that done? Based on the scaffolding of the Chinese Exclusion Act and under this ferociously racist, invidious quota system, which said, okay, of those 150,000, this percentage can come from Sweden, Great Britain, France, a higher percentage. Italy, very small percentage. China, no percentage. Now Japan, no percentage. So what one discovers is that the Chinese Exclusion Act actually is the tip of a large, large subterranean mass, which has to do with how Americans have thought and put into law practices that made invidious distinctions among people of color, of race, of nationality, of ethnicity, of religion across the board. And one of the reasons why it was forgotten so quickly and carried under is that it was not simply the Chinese, but the Chinese were the leading edge of what was a much larger phenomenon. I mean, you look at the law as it was enshrined in the early 1920s, is based on a degree of like risible pseudoscience, the science of eugenics, which was actually used, and it was in the testimony in Congress to say there are these differences, hierarchical differences in intelligence, in capability, in the willingness to work amongst people of different races, different nationalities. That's a big, big thing to kind of get your hands around. So my hope is that this film will be a comprehensive way. Looking at this particular history will be a comprehensive way to, if you've never done so before at all, begin to get your arms around a profoundly troubling and difficult American phenomenon, which goes back to the 17th century and continues down to this day, which is how we sort our world according to race, religion, of course, class, in a way that has been extremely difficult and continues to be extremely difficult. And it's not just the Muslims who are the Chinese of the 21st century now. It's the Mexicans as well. The Chinese did this amazing double duty. They were both the Mexicans who were going to take your job, and they were the Muslims who were going to kind of somehow insidiously contaminate your society.
Any thoughts that you might have, Mae or Li-Shin, about your hopes for the impact of the film?
When we talk about it, when we're making the film, I talk about it in my classes, there's this jaw-dropping reactions from people who didn't know about Chinese exclusion. Yeah. And then when you start making these connections, as Ric is doing so well, to immigration policy in general, people's jaws are on the floor. And I do think it's not an easy history for people to accept, because it really is that we've been an inclusive nation, but we've always been an exclusive nation, and we've always had both, and that's not easy for people to accept, because people want to believe we're a nation of immigrants, and then there are a lot of qualifications to that, right? Well, the good immigrants, right? And then there you go.
The hardworking ones from Norway.
The legal ones, right? There it goes. But I think it's really important history, because hopefully it can push people to think more deeply about the challenges in our own time, which is a continuity from what we've had for. It's not new at all. It's not new at all. And I would just say, Wong Kim Ark, yes, but the other thing that came out of Chinese exclusion in the Supreme Court was the deportation laws. Mm-hmm. The fact that people in deportation proceedings have no rights. Right. Full stop, no rights. That's why we have things today called expedited removal, mandatory removal. It all comes also from Chinese exclusion, that because it's a question of national security, if you're an immigrant in a deportation proceeding, you don't have any rights. You don't have rights under the Bill of Rights of the Constitution.
You know, the historian Ren Cho-yu, who helped us with this project really immeasurably as well, says something which we included at the end of the very end of the film, which was, he said, you know, the story of the Chinese Exclusion Act in the context of this ongoing American experiment is that it shows that something can be democratic, it can be legal, and it can be wrong.
It's a very moving moment.
That, for me, of all the jaw-dropping things, Mae, is really the thing that kind of puts its arms, it causes you do this kind of like, it's almost a vertiginous, whoa, because we're so used to thinking democratic, legal, right. And it causes you to really kind of redistrict how you're thinking about yourself and the world, to realize, right, we make mistakes individually and collectively all the time. And it's not done. It's always like the foot of the Statue of Liberty that's as yet unassembled. So she's in the harbor today, but it's still unassembled. And it's still in pieces, and it's still up to us to understand how to put those pieces together, not relying on any compass that's any clearer than our own conscience, than our own sense of justice, than our own sense of, do we support the rule of law? Do we support some basic realities of the American experience? And you know, that's why I find it's challenging and inspiring history, because it really, more than any other piece of history I've had the good fortune of stumbling into, it kind of opens your head, it opens your heart, and it makes you really, you know, it puts you in a place where the headwinds are strong, where it's not really clear, and you have to really sort of stake your own set of principles. And my hope would be anybody coming to this story would get that. There's no clear, you know, we have not had birthright citizenship since Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson figured it out 250 years ago, and so it's all set. It's something that's part of a process that we have to engage with. And then you take this history and you look out the door today and realize, as Mae and Li-Shin have been saying, the rhetoric's exactly the same. John Bigler, the second governor of California, was using exactly the same. It was fake news then.
There's even reference to a wall. For all those cartoons you showed, they say the
invidious.
Chinese wall.
It was not factually accurate. You know, 0.2% of the American population was Chinese at a time when millions of Irish people had come in. We clearly, if you're worried about an overload of immigrants, you had much more to fear from the Irish than you did from the Chinese. So it's not fact-based. It's emotion and politics and power-based. And it has been remarkably successful. You really don't have to change the language of the 1850s or the 1870s or the 1880s. You hear in it exactly what's being said today, with no greater degree of factual accuracy. It's not about facts. It's about appealing to something frightened and worried in a underclass in America by politicians who realize how they can use it as a wedge.
Well, and it gains steam at moments of economic crisis, as
That's right.
we were discussing earlier. In 1871, the big crash, a lot of unemployed white men suddenly saying, my problem is that guy.
That's right.
So.
And suddenly all of America turns into like a panic room.
Yep.
You have to protect yourself from some imminent invasion, which is, so anybody who feels vulnerable is not defenseless, but is vulnerable in the face of this kind of rhetoric. So hopefully the work that Mae's done, the work that this generation of historians has done, and the work that student filmmakers following that can do, is to say, wait a second, there's a history to this rhetoric. What's the fact? You know, how truthy is it? How much can we believe in it? And what's really going on when people say there is a horde of servile Chinese prey to despotism who are coming in, who are slaves, not one of which fact is, or that they're all prostitutes, or that they're all coolies. So it's really remarkable how there's this kind of the way in which this sort of the mind-numbing political rhetoric, mind-numbing in its effectiveness, gets conjured up again and again in exactly the same way. And that's what we found, you know, working on the film over the last 3 or 4 years. Suddenly, we're in a whirlwind of xenophobia, and populism and nativism, and we might as well be back in the 1850s in California.
The cartoons are just different.
Right, although not that much.
They're not that
Build the
different.
wall.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Hi, my name is Susan Akina.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, I'm really glad
you're
to be
a Susan
here.
under 40. I have to build a shrine to you.
I'm really glad to be here because I am an immigration attorney, and I'm also co-chair of the Asian American Bar Association Immigration Committee. So I heard about this event and I was very intrigued, and I definitely wanted to come because the Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act was something that I heard about only when I took a niche Asian American literature class in college, and it really made my blood boil. And I was like, how could nobody know about this? And so I went around campus and shared about the Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act to everyone I knew. And even now, I have certain lunchtime conversations with people, and I talk to them, and everyone's just really surprised and shocked because they're not aware of our nation's history. And so, I want to encourage my friends and other attorneys who couldn't make it today to learn more about this. And so I want to help you, publicize this event and publicize the film. I'm definitely on board. And we have collaborated with the Asia Society, the Museum of Chinese Americas, MoCA, a lot of other organizations in New York City. And so please tell me how I can help you, because this is something that is really important to me, and I think more people should hear about this.
Great.
Thank you.
I'll come talk to you.
but also they can all watch the film on PBS on May 29th, correct? Yes. Also, this podcast will be available online as of tonight. So if anyone wants to see this conversation, they can just click on the green space icons and innovators with Ric Burns, and it'll be there. But thank you so much for coming and for the work you do. I'm curious, in your law school classes, you didn't study the Exclusion Act either?
I did, but in my immigration class, there was mention of this, but it was just
in passing,
like a paragraph, right?
Because I was
There's not much attention drawn to this.
I was asking you about the scholarship around it, and you said sort of in law school and a little bit in departments, but it's not.
Well, the way immigration, and you should correct me if I'm wrong, but the way immigration is taught in law schools, it's either taught as a very practical field, because immigration law is really complicated.
Right.
So it's taught in a very practical way without any historical context and without the background. So in some schools it's taught its relationship to constitutional law, because it falls outside of the Constitution. But a lot of law schools don't think immigration is a serious subject for legal scholarship. They think it's a kind of a practical aspect of law, like tax law. Mm-hmm. Susan, would you say that's true? That's my impression.
Yeah, there's a certain, I'm going off the record, but there's definitely a certain pecking order, right, when it comes to the type of law that people analyze for legal scholarship. And you're right, like immigration or tax kind of falls lower, and constitutional law is like held up here. Corporate law is, maybe second. But a lot of these laws that pertain to social justice, right, or laws that actually impact everyday lives of people are sort of just not spoken about as much, and especially in elite law schools, right? So if you go to one of the top law schools in the country, we don't really have this conversation.
Right.
Although this does cut to constitutional law, because the heart of the 14th Amendment, so it's interesting. Fascinating. Wow. I think maybe we have time for one more question.
Thank you. My name is Hope, and thank you very much for the panel discussion. I have a question for Mae, and I have one for our filmmakers. So Mae, how did you come across with China Exclusion Act at the first place? And maybe like it has been in your mind for a long time before the idea of converting this or shedding light on this part of history in the form of film. So how did that process come through? And the question for filmmakers is, if you can travel back in time and then actually capture the footage of one incident or like one interview subject, which one in this film will you choose and why?
Interesting. Great question.
Asian American studies kind of came into being in the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s. Same era as African American studies, Latino studies. So once we started studying it, it's really the first thing you come across. There's certain iconic moments in Asian American studies. There's Chinese exclusion, the Japanese American internment. It's pretty much a set piece, and but that's now since it's 50 years of teaching and research and scholarship. And unfortunately, we still don't have a lot of Asian American studies programs in our colleges. I think there's a lot more in California, but east of California, there is very little. But there's, I think, a really robust body of work done by not just historians, but other social scientists and scholars in the humanities that have really gone way beyond, in some ways, we've gone beyond the exclusion law. And that's kind of the big backdrop, the big setting for everything. But I think now, actually I'm writing a book now about Chinese exclusion, but I'm writing about it from a transnational perspective because I'm looking at how exclusion became policy, not just in the United States, but also in the British settler colonies, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. So I'm looking at gold rushes in all those places and how they gave rise to anti-Chinese politics. So that's a new move to try to look at exclusion politics from a more global perspective. But I think we have the student activism of the civil rights era to thank for opening up these questions for students and for scholars to go research and learn about. It's all there. You have to go find. It's not that hard to find. It's all there, but people weren't looking before. I love the question she asked.
I love that
Yeah,
question.
I know.
Yeah,
I think, to be a fly on the wall, there's so many, from Samsonbo to, Ji Gam, who wrote this beautiful, he was the first Congregationalist Chinese American minister. And during the Geary Act, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was being renewed, it was mandated that every Chinese needed to carry a photo ID. And if you're kind of stopped or caught without it, you could be deported. So there's so many characters that, you just wish you knew more about what their life was like, what it was like for them, how they battled the injustices of the time. Wang Qingfu, a really, really charismatic, dynamic, character who really, really was vocal at the time.
Didn't he create the term Chinese American? He was the first one to use that term.
Yeah, he
Mae, I was
created
wondering
this,
if you could talk about a family who you've made really vitally alive, which is Joseph Tape and Mamie Tape and Mary
family.
Tape.
Yeah.
Right.
That's where I would like
Yeah.
to be, but I would like to be there with you. Because
Well, what's really interesting is that we know these cases, Wang Kim-ark, Fang Yuting, which is the deportation case, and we know so little about the individuals who are the plaintiffs in these cases because the briefs are they don't tell you that much. Fang Yuting was a laundryman in New York. But we don't, it takes a lot of digging to find out who these people are. And so the family I wrote about was involved in a California case called Tape v. Hurley, which was about the exclusion of Chinese children from from public schools. And, we know from the legal papers that the father, Joseph Tape, was a drayman. He was an expressman. He delivered baggage in San Francisco. His daughter, Mamie Tape, was the girl who wanted to go to school, but there's very little there. And I was doing research on something else, and this is how the best research gets uncovered, when you're looking for something else and you find the real jewel, right? And I found a report written in 1914 in the Department of Labor, which is where immigration was housed at the time, about Chinese who worked as interpreters for the Immigration Service. And it was 20 pages about corrupt Chinese interpreters, how they all took bribes and et cetera, et cetera. And the very last person they discuss is a guy named Frank Tape. Now, Tape is not a Chinese name. So I said, Tape. That's... So I went to the census records, and I looked up Joseph Tape, the father, and there's Frank as the son, and Mamie, the daughter. And then I followed the census in time, and indeed, Frank becomes an interpreter. But not only that, Mamie marries a guy who's an interpreter, and there's another sister who marries an interpreter. So I discovered this whole, little social class of Chinese American interpreters, and more broadly, there were brokers, there were cultural brokers, there were immigration brokers. They were people who, because they were born and raised in the United States, had more facility in English. They were more assimilated, if you will. They were the ones who worked for immigration, for Wells Fargo Bank, for the police courts, and translated for the immigrants. And I thought that was a really interesting story, because these people were, in a way, their inclusion in the middle class was on the backs of people who were excluded, right? They made their livings by translating for state agencies that were excluding people, right? Or they made money, selling tickets to them and this kind of thing. So they were the one little group that made a crack in the wall of exclusion, a tiny crack. And they were the first middle class Chinese Americans.
It bears saying, though, that case that the family prosecuted for their daughter to be able to enter this public school, they won the case initially.
They won the case.
This is 70 years before Brown v. Board of Education.
Yeah, this is 1886. So it's after exclusion. So they win the case. But the court, it's the Supreme Court of California, the court says, well, we have to go on the law, and California, after the Civil War, had a law that says all children have a right to public education. So you can't really exclude the Chinese. But, wink, wink, you could set up another law that says they have to go to a segregated school.
So separate
but equal. Right.
So.
I have to say that, Mae, the work that you've done, and broadly, but then also specifically in this case, is so moving, having followed, Joseph Tape, and we don't even know who Mary Tape's, what her Chinese name was. It's lost. She was sort of found her way into kind of a child welfare system in San Francisco in the 1860s, 1870s. She takes the name of one of the white women,
matrons,
who's Mary McGladdery, so she becomes Mary McGladdery. She marries now Joseph Tape, and so it's a story that's sort of it's exactly like what one might see in the Lower East Side. It has wherever immigrants in America or anywhere come, you have these extraordinary stories which get woven together, and the power of your unearthing and description of this family as they kind of seized hold really on their own steam. I'm talking about Joseph and Mary, and made their way. She became a painter and artist. He loved to hunt with dogs. He really made his bones after having sort of started out really as a drayman, really at the lower end. And then to discover that, they weren't living in Chinatown, they were living on Russian Hill in San Francisco.
And then they moved to Berkeley, to the suburbs.
Right. Yeah. So they were living the American dream, and
he built 5 houses in Berkeley.
Found themselves running smack up against these things, which they did not take lying down. And Mary herself was very, very moving. Yeah. I mean, her rage found its way to the front pages of San Francisco newspapers at the time, saying, "My children will never, never, never go to this separate but equal school."
Yeah.
But of course, there was no choice.
No.
And they're the first kids at the door when the school opens.
Yeah. Well, And what you're bringing up here is really one of the most beautiful things about the film, is the hope in this Pandora's box of horrors of this Exclusion Act. The through line throughout is hope, and it's the note on which the film ends. And the incredible fight and faith of these people just really comes through. So I want to thank you, having watched the film and been moved, and invite all of you to see it on May 29th. And best of luck with it, and thank you so much for being with us tonight on Icons and Innovators.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us so much.
May 29th, what time?
I think 9.
9
o'clock,
I think
PBS.
We could have
Could
gone
be
on,
8.
but
Could be 8. Check
the
local
stop
listings.
time.
Yeah, check your local listing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan.
That was fun.
Thank you, Mae.
Thank you for all the plugs you gave my book. That was